Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Autumn 2021 lecture series of the Virtual Museum Lecture Series presented by the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center. Our community is filled with diverse stories, and we recognize that our story begins with the Indigenous peoples of this land. We acknowledge that we are broadcasting this lecture on lands that have been inhabited by Indigenous peoples for millennia, and we would like to honor the centuries of Indigenous peoples who walked on Turtle Island before us. My name is Adrian Petrie, and I'm the Visitor Services Coordinator here at the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center. Welcome back to the lecture series. We hope these lectures provide a bit of historical joy and also spark imagination and exploration of our city's rich history. If you're joining us for the first time, why not go back and view all the other lectures that have been presented in the last year? There are now over 20 lectures for you to enjoy, actually 27 lectures for you to enjoy. Just look for the playlist Virtual Museum Lecture Series on our YouTube channel. We're also happy to announce that the lecture audio is being added to our podcast. VMLS via podcast will help to share the lectures with an even wider audience. So if you're new, you can catch up via podcast. Or if you want to go back and listen to your favorite lecture again, it'll be there waiting for you in the coming weeks. As we dive into some exciting history tonight, please feel free to make use of the chat box to answer questions and or send comments. And I see our guest tonight is in the comments. And actually, Brian, if you are watching, if you'd like to join me in the Zoom now, that would be great. So we'll moderate all your questions and comments and conversation during and at the end of the presentation. There is a slight delay in the broadcast, so if we do miss your question, we will get to it at the end of the presentation. I don't know about you, but I was shocked. It was already November. What? How is it November? So not including tonight's lecture, that means that we only have 2 remaining lectures in our Autumn 2021 lecture series. I'll take this opportunity to remind you all to mark your calendars for the upcoming lectures, including on November 16th, Sarah will use housing, suburban development, and sprawl as a lens to consider some of the major socioeconomic issues that face the people of St. Catharines in the 20th century. By paying close attention to housing trends and issues in the city over time, we can gain vital insight into how big societal shifts impacted our community, from immigration to the Great Depression, the post-war boom, and more. And on November 30th, Kathleen will explore when the world was plunged into war in 1914 and how everything changed. Life would never be the same for those who fought and for those left behind. This lecture is a personal look at the First World War through the eyes and voices of those who lived through this changing moment in time. But that's not all. I'm excited to share the dates of our Winter 2022 lecture series with you. That's all you get for now, though. Please mark your calendars. We will announce the lecture topics and lecturers and guest lecturers during the lecture on November 30th. Of course, I forgot to advance all my slides during this time. You've seen most of these before. Here's the dates. This is the important slide for tonight. Tuesday, February 1st, Tuesday, February 15th. They're all Tuesdays. So March 1st, we're going to break for March break, just in case anybody wants to be away. March 29th, April 12th, April 26th, May 10th, and May 24th. And again, we'll announce those lectures coming up on November 30th. I'd like to take a moment to encourage you to make a donation to the museum in support of our programming. Your donations help us to continue to provide the high quality and enjoyable programming that you have come to expect from us. We really appreciate any donation you're able to make. Give us a call at 905-984-8880 during our operating hours to make a donation. And new this fall, you can now make a donation online via our ActiveNet portal. The link to the portal was included in your email reminder this evening. Your donation makes a difference. Thank you. Right. I'm gonna stop sharing now. All righty. Order in the court. By the power vested in me, I hereby introduce our guest lecturer this evening. Brian Narhi was born and raised in St. Catharines. He holds a BA from Brock University in Classical Literature and History. Brian, you can turn your camera on if you want, so I'm not all alone.
Do I have to?
I shall continue, just so they know you're actually here. Brian Narhi was born and raised in St. Catharines. He holds a BA from Brock University in Classical Literature and History, as well as an MA and PhD from the University of Toronto in Comparative Literature. His historical study is quite broad, ranging from ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics to a very special dedication to our own local history here in St. Catharines. Brian worked as the Assistant Deputy Land Registrar in the Toronto Land Registry Office. He is the staff historian at the Archaeological Services, Inc. He has published various articles and contributions to books, most of which I'm sure everyone has read, including in our own publications here at the museum, most recently the Fallen Workers of the Welland Ship Canal book called Triumph and Tragedy. In his spare time, he enjoys books, collecting, heirloom vegetable gardening, genealogy, and cats, as you can see from his Zoom background. He is also chair of the city's Heritage Advisory Committee in his spare time. We are thrilled to welcome Brian Narhi to the lecture series. Enjoy the lecture, everybody. Brian, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Adrian.
Are you able to share? I might not be able. Oh, perfect. Good to go.
There we go. Okay. Hopefully everybody can hear me and see my slides. I've been having some trouble with my internet server for the last couple of weeks. Sometimes my phone kicks out when I least expect it, and the same with the internet. So hopefully we'll get through this okay without any technical glitches. I've always found court records to be a really interesting area to do historical research in, and also it's fascinating for genealogical work. And one of the things I love doing is to deflate people who do their genealogy, and of course they set their ancestors up on pedestals, and then they find out that they had an ancestor who their name shows up in court records someplace, and their immediate reaction is, oh, well, that never happened in my family. We actually have court records, court filings that exist in various archives. There's some certainly at the museum. There's a lot at the Archives of Ontario. There's a lot of court records that are dealt with in the local newspapers at the time, also in books. Unfortunately, a lot of court records have been lost through the years, partly due to things like the War of 1812, when the town of Niagara was burnt. So a lot of the early records went there. And I think through the years, the Attorney General of the province, I think because of the sheer volume of these records, they feel that they can't keep everything. So some things have also been turfed out because of that. But there's still thousands and thousands of court records to choose from. And because of the state of the records, the outcome of all court cases is not known. But anyway, so let's get into the presentation. The only thing I have to say, I do have to apologize for the quality of some of the images that I'm going to show you. Some of them were taken from microfilm of newspapers, and of course we all know what newspaper microfilm can be like. Okay, why is
Brian, if you click, you should be able to advance after that.
where's my there we go.
Yeah.
Okay, so the criminal laws of England were introduced into the province of Quebec in 1763 and extended into the western part of Quebec in 1774. And of course, the Niagara district was part of the province of Quebec until, Upper Canada was created in 1791. So between 1783 and 1788, there were no local courts in Niagara. And during that time, we formed part of the District of Montreal. And a lot of the early settlers who lived in Niagara were upset with the fact that we were part of the Judicial District of Montreal, because we were, of course, governed by the old French laws and English common law, or common pleas, which gave kind of a weird double judgment, double-edged system to the judgments that were made. In 1788, the province of what became Upper Canada was divided into 4 judicial districts, and the first local court that was established here was the General Quarter Sessions of the Peace. The courthouse, of course, was at Niagara. Niagara at that time was called the District of Nassau, and the magistrates at the Quarter Sessions were able to try all but the most serious of offenses. So this is a page from the Quebec Almanac of 1763, showing we had 5 judges for the Niagara District. We had 6 justices of the peace. We had a sheriff. We had a clerk, Philip Frey. We had a couple of coroners. So they were the first court officials that set to work in Niagara. The judges for the Quarter Sessions were appointed by the government. The number of appointments grew steadily. We went from 5 judges and 6 justices in 1788 to 86 justices of the peace by 1833. The judges, or the magistrates at the Quarter Sessions, had various powers. They could confirm township officials who were elected each year. They could appoint village and township constables. And it's kind of interesting to note that most of the constables at the time were blacksmiths or tavern keepers. And you might wonder why that was the case. Well, of course, a blacksmith is probably going to be a big burly guy who can take care of himself and any malefactor. But also travelers on the roads would have to have their horses shod periodically. So if somebody was riding through the village or through the township, the blacksmith might know about it. And of course, everybody was thirsty at that time too. So tavern and innkeepers could probably unwittingly serve, beer or whiskey or something to a criminal who was fleeing, or he would hear gossip about, hey, did you see a certain fellow come through this area? So they knew what was going on. The Quarter Sessions, of course, was a lower tier court. It tried lesser offenses, people who were drunk and disorderly, assault and battery, petty theft, swearing, blasphemy, selling liquor without a license, driving sleighs in the winter without bells. I mean, there are all kinds of things that the Quarter Sessions dealt with. And the court acted like a regional government. It had the authority to issue money for road and bridge maintenance, to pay relief money for destitute individuals, for coroners' requests. They issued shop and tavern licenses. They regulated the Board of Health and so on. The one blaspheme case that I mentioned there was kind of an interesting one. It was the Reverend, I think his name was Solomon Rose, versus Jacob Hostetter. And Rose was preaching at the schoolhouse at the 10 Mile Creek. And one of the things that he happened to say was that, the Church of England didn't know what they were talking about. And all the books and publications issued by the Church of England were not God's word, and they were full of lies. It was actually the devil speaking through this book. And, Jacob Hostetter took great umbrage to the remarks that the Reverend Rose was making. And the two guys actually got into fisticuffs on the banks of the 10 Mile Creek. And of course, they were fined £10 to keep the peace. So things are not always rosy in Grantham Township. Like I say, Upper Canada was formed out of the western part of Quebec by the Constitutional Act of 1791. And one of the first acts that was passed by the legislature in Niagara-on-the-Lake was to introduce British law and trial by jury into the province. That was exclusively English law that was introduced into Upper Canada. Other acts that were passed by the government in the first couple of years established the legal framework for the province. In 1792, we could have jails and courthouses in every district. District courts that could try cases that didn't exceed 15 pounds in value. The surrogate courts, if you had to have an estate probated or to have somebody's will looked into, that was established at that time. Common pleas, which was gradually phased out and then reintroduced. The King's Bench in 1794, that was the assizes. King's Bench was responsible for trying more serious crimes. The Court of Requests, which basically went between 1794 and 1841, that was a small claims court. We had legislation that would regulate juries, and the Court of Chancery was added in 1837. And the Court of Chancery was an equity court that dealt with real estate. So in 1791, the blue arrow indicates the location of where the first courthouse and jail were going to be in the town of Niagara-on-the-Lake. Being the provincial capital and the district capital, of course, it was made perfect sense to locate the court there. So the jail and the court were supposed to be at the corner of Queen and Mississauga streets, but the local business community and the important men in the town, in the district, felt that the court and jail should be actually closer to the downtown. So it was where the red arrow is at the corner of Prideaux and King Streets. This, of course, is a map of Niagara-on-the-Lake that was done in 1810, the gray map. And on the left-hand side there, you can see the location of the courthouse and the jail clearly marked, basically just across the street from St. Mark's Church, or the churchyard, the church property. And on the right-hand side, you can see what the first court and jailhouse site looks like today. It's just across the street from where the Masonic Hall was. And of course, our first jailer, our first sheriff for the Niagara district was none other than Thomas Merritt, who later brought his family into St. Catharines. On the left-hand side, you can see a picture of the blockhouses at Fort George. And the reason why I put that picture in was because they think that that is what the original jail would have looked like in Niagara-on-the-Lake, just a boxy wooden structure like this. And during the War of 1812, or just prior to the time of the War of 1812, they think that this building might have, or the jail, had between 300 and 400 prisoners, most of them suspected of treason at the time. And that building, of course, was burnt in the day of the Battle of Queenston Heights, October 1812. And I think Sheriff Merritt had to go and open up the jail and let the prisoners out because the building was on fire. So after the War of 1812, it was the new jail and courthouse were built in 1817. It was a brick building. It was on the outskirts of the town, and it was later used as Miss Rye's Western Home. Orphaned British children were brought, to Upper Canada or Canada West, and that was their home until they were farmed out to local people who needed young children to help with the farm, or who just wanted to have children to adopt for themselves. The one picture is an architect's drawing of what the building was supposed to look like. The other one is a photograph from the Niagara Historical Museum showing what the building really looked like in real life. And the red arrow shows where that building was, the old courthouse was located. It was on Rye Street, and just opposite Cottage. in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and it's now the site of the Rye Heritage Park. The quarter session records start in 1828 for the most part, and one of the things that we have in every single sitting of the quarter sessions is a list of the prisoners that were housed at the Niagara Jail. And because the jailer had to supply food, washing, wood, candles, all these things to keep the jail running. So he had to keep a list of all the prisoners who were there, how long they were confined, and then he could then charge the local magistrates for the cost of keeping the prisoners. So it didn't come out of his own pocket. And as you can see, even in April to July of 1828, there were several prisoners being held in the jail. Then we have actual printed jail registers for that same building in Niagara-on-the-Lake that pick up in the 1860s, 1865 through to about 1866. And then after that, the jail moved to St. Catharines. And these jail registers are actually quite detailed. They list the native country where the person came from, what their age was, what their occupation was, where they were living at the time that they were charged with a crime, what their religion was, whether they were married or single, if they could read or write. And it even had a comment about their moral habits, whether they were temperate or intemperate, their full name, the date that they were tried, what they were being charged with, the name of the magistrate, how long they were being sentenced for, and other remarks. So you can see that they were being charged with things like perjury and larceny, assault and battery, drunken disorderly, and they were being sent away 6 months in the jail, 2 months in the jail, being sent to the 3 years in the reform penitentiary. Some of the sentences were quite stiff. Another good source for looking up malefactors is in the newspapers, and the St. Catharines Constitutional in particular like to print schedules of convictions showing all the different cases that came before the courts. And this particular schedule of convictions is only about the top third that was printed in the paper. I mean, it was practically a full page showing the names of the people that appeared before the magistrates. So here again, you have the name of the prosecutor, the plaintiff, the defendant, the nature of the charge, the date when they were convicted, the name of the judge, whether they were fined or not, whether it was paid, to whom it was paid, and if they actually ended up going to jail or not. And as you can see, they were, the length of time they were in jail, varied 7 days, 20 days, 15 days, whatever. The Niagara Jail was, of course, quite an unpleasant place to be. The grand jury would regularly have to inspect the premises and report upon it. The jailer, Peter Wheeler, was accused of using abusive, obscene language and threatening the prisoners. He would withhold fuel from them. He'd serve them putrid food. He'd give them insufficient water. He wouldn't allow visitors to come and see the people that were locked up. He must be compelled to empty the buckets containing the filth and excrement of the prisoners. And for a while in the 1830s, he had hired a black man to flog the prisoners in order to keep law and order within the jail itself. Debtors and hardened criminals, male and female, they were all locked up together. There was no distinction made between them. The debtors eventually put pressure on the local authorities, and they were able to get themselves segregated into another separate part of the jail. But even so, they complained that the debtor's room is crowded with prisoners. It's uncomfortable and filthy. The floor has a green plank with a space in between that's filled with dirt and maggots. The straw on our beds has not been changed in 10 months. The stench of the filth buckets is very offensive. Jail hours for communication or visiting with friends is only between 8 and 4. A servant stands by to overhear all conversations, and they recommended that a new pine floor be put in. The straw had to be changed, and the filth buckets changed and cleaned at least twice daily and left out in the morning for the sun to bleach them. Rooms should have proper beds, tables, wash bowls, basins, etc., etc. So wasn't a very nice place to be. In the days before asylums were established in the province, the insane and destitute were supported by those of the community who wanted to look after them. In St. Catharines, we had the widow Phoebe Godell, who was considerably advanced in life and infirm, who was caring for an insane girl who was deaf and dumb named Harriet Haig. She looked after her for several years during the 1820s and 30s, but was still owed £30 by the district. The costs, of course, were paid for after they were approved by the magistrates. The less fortunate were confined in the Niagara Jail or sent to the Kingston penitentiary. And as an example of that, in July 1840, a lunatic named Mrs. Baker was confined at the Niagara Jail. The misery of the prisoners was doubled by her presence. The unfortunate woman remains in her room, and the effluvia therefrom is almost pestilential, causing prisoners the almost entire impossibility to eat their meals, in addition to which her noise and screams during the night destroys our rest. After 1848, the courthouse that was built in 1817 fell out of use as a courthouse because this building was built on Queen Street in Niagara, and the old court building, I think, continued to serve as the jail. Around the same time, the courthouse was built in St. Catharines. It started out as our city hall, but after 1866, when the county seat was moved to St. Catharines, this building was not only our city hall, but it was also our courthouse and temporary jail. St. Catharines was incorporated as a town of the Board of Police in 1845. The mayor served as the president of the Board of Police, which was our court. And this board could also appoint constables for the city. It tried local non-capital cases, and it heard many cases that would have been sent to the quarter sessions at Niagara. So if Mayor Senzik is listening this evening, just be thankful that you weren't mayor back then, because in addition to your other duties, you would have had to have been presiding magistrate in the police court. And a lot of the people who were appointed as magistrates and justices of the peace back in the Georgian and Victorian periods, they were patronage appointments, not based upon what you know, but who you knew. And a lot of these people did not have any legal background. So in order to help them out, things like the Provincial Justice was published, and it was the equivalent of Justice for Dummies. And it was the kind of book that you could pick it up, open it up, and look in the index. And if you wanted to find out what to do with a vagrant, how to deal with a drunkard, what to do with a destitute person, you could just look it up in this book and maybe confer with a lawyer and pass judgment. And there were all sorts of these books that were printed. I think I've got about half a dozen different ones in my collection. In 1866, like I said, the jail moved from Niagara-on-the-Lake to St. Catharines. This building stood on Niagara Street, roughly about where the Ukrainian Credit Union is, just north of Welland Avenue on the east side. Um, my city bus, when I was a child, used to go right past the jail. And my mother, different times, if I was misbehaving on the bus, would lean over and she'd hiss in my ear, "If you don't smarten up, that's where you're going to go." Um, anyway, when I was in, I guess, tail end of public school, the early part of high school was when this building was demolished. And I actually managed to get myself up to the site when the building was being ripped down. And I got myself a chunk of limestone that was in the building. That's the one that's in the other picture there. It's a fairly heavy block of limestone. I use it as a doorstop. And of course, what do we do with a drunken sailor? Well, we lock them up in the Port Dalhousie jail, which, as you know, for a long time had the distinction of being thought to be the smallest jail in the province. We now know that it's not the smallest, but it's certainly one of the oldest, and it was probably quite an unpleasant building to be locked up in as well. I don't think you could fit too many drunken sailors into it. They were probably just in there overnight until they sobered up. And if they did commit anything more serious than just being drunk and disorderly, if they got into a fight or something that had to be dealt with by the magistrates, and they'd probably be sent up to St. Catharines for hearing. And the other thing too about any courts, anything that happened in St. Catharines, if it was a matter that still needed further dispensation of justice, they would then be sent from St. Catharines down to Niagara on the Lake for the higher court to deal with. And ultimately, if you were a really bad guy, guilty of murder or treason or whatever, you could probably end up being sent to the Kingston penitentiary. And we know that some local inhabitants in St. Catharines, like Willis Stark, who was a member of the Black community, he was sent to the Kingston penitentiary in 1862 because he stole a bushel of apples. And of course, his wife was sick at the time. He had, a number of children, and the local townsfolk felt so strongly about the sentence being too harsh that they all signed a petition, sent that off to the government asking for a clemency. And Willis Stark was, as far as I know, I think he was released from the penitentiary. This is just a couple of contemporary views of what the inside of Kingston Pen looked like. The cell blocks on the right-hand side there look really, really uncomfortable and depressing. And on the other side, there's engravings of the different things that prisoners had to do when they were there, how they ate, how they slept, marching off to break stones and stuff. As part of their punishment, they had workshops, for making shoes and leather goods, things that could be sold outside of the jail. And even women were sent to the Kingston penitentiary. Of course, they were segregated. They had a men's portion and a women's portion. And I should also mention too about the jail system, that even children at that time were being sent to prison. We have records of kids in St. Catharines as young as 8 and 10 years old being sent to the jail in Niagara or the jail on Niagara Street for, helping themselves to candy or something in a merchant shop, and being found guilty of the crime and being sent off for a few days to learn more tricks of the trade from hardened criminals, I'm afraid. The other higher courts that existed in Upper Canada during the 18th and 19th centuries were common pleas. These were for non-capital cases between subjects. So it would be like, say, between myself and John Smith. So we didn't have to have the king versus John Smith or whatever. King's or Queen's Bench, in theory, this court followed the King's Court in England. In Upper Canada, it was reserved for more serious cases like murder, treason, arson, things like that. It was presided over by the Chief Justice and 3 of his associates. And this court would travel, it was based in York, in Toronto, and it would travel out to the various districts. They had a set time of year when King's Bench or Queen's Bench would be heard in the different districts. Chancery, I already mentioned that, created 1837. It dealt with trusts, laws governing real estate, the estates of lunatics, guardianship of infants. And this court made it easier for people to recover certain debts, such as default lands in defaulted mortgage cases. We had district courts and county courts, which functioned during that time. And in 1881, the entire system was revised with the Judicature Act, and the function of these courts was taken over by the Supreme Court for Ontario. Most of the cases heard in the Niagara courts involved petty or grand larceny. Petty theft was originally limited to goods valued at 12 pence or less. Grand larceny was 12 pence or more. This was increased to 20 shillings or £1 in 1789. Grand theft in theory was punishable by being hung. The larcener could be pardoned by the benefit of the clergy if they could read a Bible verse, which is known as the neck verse. The law was later changed, and they said that no larcener could be executed on a first conviction, but they could be transported out of the province. And both petty and grand theft were punishable by whipping, fines, and imprisonment. Burglary, which was theft in a house at night for the purpose of stealing goods valued at more than 40 shillings or £2, or to commit murder or some other crime, could still be punishable by death until 1842. And pardons were granted provided that the culprits removed themselves out of Upper Canada for life. Perjury could be, again, punishable by fines, imprisonment, banishment, or standing in the pillory. Forgery and counterfeiting were considered to be a felonious activity if it was done for banknotes or promissory notes. And in June of 1809, Sheriff Merritt reported that there were 5 prisoners in the Niagara Jail who were forging American banknotes. They were tried at the assizes because it was considered a capital crime. They were found guilty of defrauding the public. They were sentenced to 6 months in prison. They were fined £20, which was a pretty high fine at the time, and they were ordered to stand in the pillory. And just at the bottom, there's a picture of a typical banknote from the 1800s that they could have forged. Other classes of crimes were offenses against the person. Was a physical thing, so this involved assault and battery, drunkenness, rape, murder, petty treason, which is when a wife murdered her husband or a servant murdered his master. Assault and battery and drunkenness, again, typical punishment, fines, imprisonment, whipping, or standing in the pillory. Rape was considered a capital crime until 1873, so you could be executed for that. One of the first murder cases in Niagara was that of a trader named William Chalmers, who was murdered by a surgeon's mate, James Lawrence, in July of 1788. Lawrence escaped custody and was wanted by the authorities, and they had warrants out for his arrest between here and Montreal. Unfortunately, I don't know what happened to Lawrence. In June of 1801, we had one of the another early murder that took place in the town of Niagara. This is where Anne Kane was killed by kicks and blows that were inflicted by her fellow servant named Charles Trump. Trump was arrested and was to stand trial at the next assizes. And of course, the newspaper account, moralized about what a sorrowful instance this is. Let it be a warning for those who forget that they are men, and in a gust of passion will assail a weak woman who is under every circumstance, has a claim for our tenderness and protection, blah, 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 blah. In 1801, we had the case of George Nemere and Mary London, alias Osborne. They poisoned Mary's husband, Bartholomew London of Saltfleet. They had a lengthy trial, and they were found guilty. The story goes that Bartholomew London was a loyalist. He was a widower who came to Upper Canada with his children. He settled in Saltfleet, became a prosperous farmer. At some point, Mary Osborne, who was from Pennsylvania, came to Saltfleet. She met London, became his housekeeper, and then married him. At some point, George Nemere, who was from Pennsylvania, came through. He was hired as a hired hand by the London family, and one thing led to another because he was a lot younger than Bartholomew London. London was probably about 30 or 40 years older than his wife Mary, and so George and Mary, they fell in love, and she got pregnant. She didn't know who the baby's father was, whether it was George or Bartholomew. George and Mary decided that they had to get rid of Bartholomew. Bartholomew was standing in the way of their happiness. So they decided to bludgeon Bartholomew, and they didn't hit him quite hard enough. They, I guess, fractured his skull, but he didn't die from it. So he was laying in bed, moaning and groaning. George said, "Okay, I'm going to go and get you some medicine that'll make you feel better." And he went off to Buffalo, and he bought some arsenic and mixed that up, and they gave that to Bartholomew, and it made Bartholomew feel even worse, and he eventually died. And they came to the conclusion that the coroner's inquest was that Bartholomew actually died from the head injury and not from the poisoning. But it was quite the story. So they were, like I say, they were sentenced to hang, but because Mary was pregnant at the time, they had to postpone her sentence until she gave birth in the jail. A large concourse of people attended the execution. They think that there were maybe 2,000 people that assembled at Niagara to see them executed. Of course, the drop on the gallows had not been perfected at the time, so Mary did her usual, farewell address. They hanged her. She was wildly, kicking while she was hanging because she was slowly being strangled. The editors of the newspaper at the time were highly incensed because people were mimicking her. They thought that was really, really disrespectful. And of course, all of this was going to be published in a pamphlet by the printer of the newspaper. And I don't know that the pamphlet was ever issued. But at any rate, part of the sentence was that both she and he, after they were hanged, they were to be given to the physicians for dissection. So they were to be drawn to the place of execution, hanged by the neck until you are not quite dead, then cut down, and your bowels are to be drawn out of your body and burnt before your face, your head then to be severed, your body quartered, and to be at the king's disposal. And as far as we know, this sentence was carried out. Similar punishments of being drawn and quartered were carried out at the Bloody Assizes, treason trials held at Ancaster in 1814. And of course, Mary London, she did give birth to this child that she was pregnant with. She claims that she did not know who the father was, whether it was her lover George or her husband Bartholomew. So, of course, Reverend Addison, being the soul of discretion, when he entered the baptism for the child in St. Mark's Church Register, put down Catherine London, and he attributed the paternity to Bartholomew, the husband. In 1836, we had another case of an execution. Aaron Seeley, who was convicted of murdering James Shields. Seeley thought that he was not fairly dealt with in his trial, that evidence was withheld and other evidence was fabricated against him. And of course, he was another one who was sent to the medical practitioners for dissection after he was hanged. Another case that I could mention, and it's one that I actually found in if you can see my little book here. It's the Christian Sentinel from 1828. And I just found reference to this the other day of Sergeant Leslie McCall. And Leslie McCall was stationed down at Niagara at Fort George, and he had a wife and a young child. And in a drunken fit, he thought that his wife had been cheating on him, and he came home and found her asleep in bed, and he wanted dinner, and dinner wasn't ready, and he just got madder and madder, and he bludgeoned her, and then he took his bayonet and bayoneted her so hard that the bayonet broke. It went through her body and it broke in the wall, and blood all over the place. And he tells his little, I think, 7-year-old daughter to get up and mop up the blood, or I'm going to do the same thing to you. And then he passed out in bed. And after he's sound asleep, the daughter goes running to the next door neighbors, and she says, "You'd better come quick. Something bad has happened. Mommy isn't breathing. Mommy's not getting up." So anyway, they quickly, came to the conclusion that yes, indeed, there was a foul murder that took place. Sergeant McCall was tried for the crime, executed, and I think he was another dissection, medical dissection. Cattle and horse theft were not subject to the death penalty in Upper Canada or Canada West, but bestiality was still considered to be a capital offense until 1869, which brings us to this fellow, William Havens, who's buried at the Homer Cemetery. He's got an absolutely wonderful tombstone, a beautiful state of preservation. And William Havens in 1796 was tried for bestiality and found guilty of the attempt. And that's why he wasn't executed, because there was no penetration. He only tried to do it, but he didn't actually penetrate. So his sentence, he was to be imprisoned for 1 month and to stand in the pillory at the jail in Niagara-on-the-Lake, in the following week at Kingston. And then the third time was as near to the place of committing the crime as possible. He was to pay a fine of 20 pounds. So that was a fairly hefty fine to pay. And it also would have been, I think, quite nasty, quite uncomfortable to be standing in the pillory in December and January. I mean, freezing your butt off. In the 1830s in St. Catharines, we have the trial of Samuel Hathaway Farnsworth. He was charged with raping his stepdaughter, who was 8 years of age, 7 years of age actually when it happened. And people gave evidence. The next door neighbor gave evidence that, and the doctors who examined the child, that they said there was evidence of some sexual contact having been done. The child herself described the act in terminology that they said no child of that age should know about. The evidence that was given at the trial as well included some neighborhood boys who claimed that the child was, they said, a little whore, that she had done things to them that no child should know about. And there was a lot of moralizing about it in the newspaper. It appeared in the St. Catharines Journal. And of course, the Niagara Reporter also reported on the case. And they just talked about how horrible it was and how disgusting it was that, you know, people were giving evidence and false evidence in the case. But it caused quite the stir. At about the same time, we had the case of John Doyle of Grantham, who assaulted his wife in 1834. Witnesses saw him dragging his wife across the field, striking her with a club or a stick that was studded with nails. The husband threatened to take an axe and that he would be the death of the woman. She was bleeding from the forehead. He was striking her with his fists. I mean, it was, you know, quite a horrible case of spousal abuse. And unfortunately, it sounds like he got off from it because it says that, you know, the witnesses were discharged from their recognizance in 1835. In January 1870, the citizens of St. Catharines were shocked to learn about the attempted murder and suicide by John Riley of his wife. He was probably drunk at the time, struck her with a hatchet. He didn't kill her, but, you know, broke bones and inflicted other wounds on her. He seems to have been an innkeeper who was up before the magistrates at an earlier date for selling liquor without a license. Of course, Mr. Riley was locked up. What happened to him? He was sent to the Kingston penitentiary, and in October of 1870, he committed suicide at the Kingston penitentiary by hanging himself, which was, you know, not a nice way to end your life. In 1880, another case of a, you know, crime against the person, Emily Fuster, age 22, who was from Miss Rye's home in Niagara-on-the-Lake, charged John Wesley Parker with rape, as well as Jedediah Taylor, Peter King, and William Graves. At least two of these men were members of the Black community. The assault took place at the railway station near Welland, Niagara, and Page Streets. It's interesting that a 6-year-old girl named Christina Jackson provided evidence. They claim that they did it because they mistook Fuster for a bad girl named Teenie Crawford. And Fuster testified that one of the descendants had connection with me, which caused quite a stir in the court. And I couldn't put the exact language that was used in the court records into this presentation with the, you know, the risk of not being G-rated anymore. But the judge did ask Fuster, like, you know, well, what do you mean he had connection with you? And she said, he took his blank, I'll leave you to guess what she called it, and he put it in my blank, and he blanked me. And, you know, everybody, you know, was like, oh my God, oh my God. Anyway, Parker got off, but the other three were found guilty. I don't know what happened to them. Their names aren't found in the census. They don't show up in the penitentiary records. They might have, you know, escaped to the States or something. But Fuster settled in St. Catharines. She was married to an older gentleman who was a butcher and a gardener. His name was Thomas Spikesman. They had a few kids. The husband died in 1912, Emily in 1932, and they're buried at Victoria Lawn. Arson was a crime that could have been punishable by death originally, but after 1841 by imprisonment. In 1798, we had one of the first cases of arson recorded in the Niagara district. In June 1869 in St. Catharines, we had a St. Catharines grocer named Francis Gifford. who was, or Clifford actually, sorry, who attempted to burn his store in order to defraud the insurance company. The goods in the store were run down, second-hand quality, I guess. They were worth $500, but the insurance covered the store for $2,500. Clifford claims that he had as much as $3,700 in the store at the time. So he and his father, Owen, I don't know why I kept misspelling the name as Gifford and Clifford. Anyway, they devised a plan that they were going to burn the store. They piled straw, cordwood, crates, coal oil barrels, and stuff in a corner of the cellar near the gas meter. During the night in question, the gas jet was opened up and the pile was set on fire. But unfortunately, they didn't understand the mechanics of how a fire burns. It needs oxygen to burn. So by closing the door, they cut the oxygen supply off to the fire, so it eventually just guttered itself out and created a lot of smoke, but it didn't really burn the building down. In the meantime, the guilty parties are hauling their stuff out of the building, and they're calling fire, fire. Unfortunately, the fire didn't get any worse because the town fire pumper was not operational at the time. It was being sent out for repairs, and the fire company easily knocked down the little bit of the smoldering blaze that was there. It was reported in the papers. For some reason, the coroner was called in to hold an investigation about this, and he determined that there was sufficient evidence to, lock the guys up and to have a further criminal investigation into it. The goods that were removed from the shop were taken to a nearby store. The mayor and some of the other town authorities wanted to have the goods brought in to City Hall or the courthouse for evidence. They wouldn't be released without a receipt, and words of a not evangelic nature followed, resulted in the police magistrate and the mayor being locked in the store because they refused to come out without the goods. Eventually, the town officials, the door was unlocked. The town officials were released with the goods, which they think included contraband liquor, which might be why they didn't want to release them. Of course, the Cliffords were also charged with intimidating a couple of witnesses, threatening them with physical harm. Here's the account from the Evening Journal about the mayor being locked up in the store while he's trying to get the evidence. And on the 14th of June, the daughter-in-law, Mrs. Clifford, brought charges against her father-in-law. She said that he was the one who stacked all the combustibles up in the basement, and she confessed that she was the one who actually lit the pile on fire. And the trial for this nefarious scheme of plunder, which for the sake of gain imperiled the lives and property of others, lasted from June the 4th to the 14th. The case was further heard by the Chief Justice because it was a capital offense. All the parties were found guilty. They were sent to the Niagara Street Jail until early 1870. Then they were sent to the Kingston Penitentiary for 5 years, less time served. And interestingly, the 1871 census listed Ellen Clifford, who was normally a member of the household, as being absent, and she was also incarcerated at the Kingston Penitentiary. And of course, Owen Clifford, the patriarch of the family, as you can see from the schedule here, he died in the penitentiary, and his death is noted in a number of places: the penitentiary records, the 1871 census, and in the provincial vital statistics. We don't know if he was buried in Kingston or here, but his widow continued to reside in Merritt, where she eventually died. The police courts in St. Catharines were supposed to take pressure off Niagara, but the newspapers, even as late as 1869, still said that they were hearing a bunch of frivolous matters. such as in 1836, complaints that people were horse racing at all times of the day on the public highway and being a nuisance. So that would be a matter that the quarter sessions would deal with. They were still looking after lunatics. In 1869, with the case of Caroline Cook, they recommended an allowance of $2.50 a week to look after her. She was so troublesome and filthy in her habits that such an allowance is not enough, as no one will undertake her cause or her case for such a sum. So they raised it to $3 a week. The quarter sessions also, as I said, dealt with things like road maintenance. Here's a sketch map showing the new road into Port Dalhousie. This is going from Lakeshore Road down the east side, the Michigan side of Port Dalhousie, crossing the mouth of the first Welland Canal and the 12-Mile Creek by Captain Christie's sawmill, and then going into the village of Port Dalhousie itself. An abandoned wretch, Ellen Rush, a brazen prostitute, vulgarly called Red Breeches. She's been locked up in the jail a number of times. She was fined $10 in costs, or to go to jail for 30 days if she hadn't paid. You'll notice that they gave her several days to pay the fine, and as it notes here, the time was given to induce her to leave town. The town fathers found out that if they gave fallen women like this time to pay a fine and they didn't pay it, if they skipped town, it would save the town or the district the cost of having to look after them while they were in jail. People could be charged for things like depositing night soil on the streets, for letting hogs run at large, contrary to the city or town bylaws. Hugh Hagan allowed his cows to run at large in the streets. Margaret O'Hara, a huckster, was charged for buying eggs and trying to resell them before 11 o'clock in the morning, contrary to market regulations. In July 1833, we had a riot in St. Catharines. Eleazar Stevenson and William Sanderson were having a glass of punch at Luther Dyer's Tavern, when somebody said that in the United States it was customary to have a glass on that day. Sanderson refused. He said he'd have no Yankee independence, and he swore he'd whip any person who would. A huge fight broke out, and George Adams, our magistrate, managed to break it up. But about 10 o'clock that night, Thomas Gilliland, who was a constable, and Sanderson and others returned to Dyer's hotel. They tried to break into the building. They were smashing windows, trying to force the doors open. They then began to hurl balls of fire of combustible material. They were hay bales that were wrapped in old cloth and soaked in kerosene and set on fire. So they were lobbing those at the hotel, trying to set it on fire, because they threatened to burn the house and kill all the people, and they were assailing the house with stones. And one eyewitness stated that different depredations of a similar nature had been committed, but not so violent. This was the most violent riot that's taken place. I felt my life was in danger. Evidence for the riot was taken by William Hamilton Merritt, and it was sent to the quarter sessions. It was given extensive press coverage in the Farmer's Journal, but unfortunately, the punishment that was meted out to the rioters was not recorded. This, of course, is just parts of two of the newspaper articles that appeared talking about the riot that appeared in the Journal. One was July the 11th, 1833. That's an editorial that somebody wrote about it. And then the other one gives an account of the affair. And of course, the Journal and the other newspapers, they would sermonize, they would moralize about these different cases. The way of the transgressor is hard. Here they're talking about two wretched females, Mary Livingston and Margaret Boygan, liberated from the Niagara Jail, where they had been confined because of their lewd and dissolute characters. They were observed in the pines near St. Catharines in a state of almost utter destitution, both of food and clothing, except whiskey. And one of them died. Coroner's inquest was held over the other. A truly more disgusting and loathsome picture of human depravity and misery could scarcely be imagined than that which was disclosed and presented to the view of the jury and bystanders collected on the occasion. And of course, the moral of the story is, don't drink, be good. The verdict, they died by the visitation of God. We also had the Court of Requests in the area. It was a small claims court that met on Saturdays and was presided over by the local magistrates. We have scattered records for this court from 1819 through to the 1830s. This is a sample of one of the subpoenas that was, or warrants, that could be issued by the court. This one hadn't been filled out. On the right-hand side, we have a witness statement by Cornelius Darby, who was a tailor, and he had made a suit of clothing for somebody and hadn't been paid for it, so that was his evidence. On the right-hand side, we have the examination of witnesses. Charles Green versus Keith. They had been near Smith's Tavern, and they saw a black man who was quarreling with two white men. They tried to break the fight up. The black man apparently started beating on the horse, and of course they were told, why don't you knock the damned Negro down? So this piece of testimony seems to be maybe something that was from one of the other courts, either the quarter sessions or the assizes. Somehow it got mixed in with the Court of Requests documents. And these Court of Requests papers are at the Lock 3 Museum. It's quite a nice little collection. Lawyers themselves could also exhibit bad behavior in court. In 1806, William Dixon of Niagara took exception to disrespectful remarks that William Weeks, a fellow lawyer, made in court about the government and the lieutenant governor. Dixon challenged Weeks to a duel. In order for them to do it legally, they crossed over to the Fort Niagara side so they could fight on American soil. Shots were fired. Of course, Mr. Weeks died, and Reverend Addison in October 7th, 1806, buried William Weeks, Esquire, fell in a duel. I don't know where he was buried, whether he was buried beside Fort Niagara or whether his remains were brought back to Niagara-on-the-Lake for burial. And the bad behavior continued. In 1870, the newspapers reported on the judge and bad language that was used by our local member, Charles Reichert, to Mr. Peter McCarthy, calling him a puppy, a liar, threatening aloud in open court to slap his face. Now, Mr. Editor, I think this sort of conduct is, to say the least, disgraceful and very improper in a court of justice. It might in a degree be overlooked in a gambling or drinking saloon or on a race course, but it should not be allowed in our courts. For those of you who might be interested in reading up further on some of the court cases and the way the courts operated, a really excellent book was printed about 10 years ago by David Murray, Justice, Morality, and Crime in the Niagara District, 1791 to 1849, Colonial Justice. It's a really good book. And I'm going to do a little bit of shameless self-advertising here. If anybody wants to read the individual cases that were tried at the quarter sessions, I compiled a transcript of all the quarter session records that I could find between 1787 and 1841, and I still have these volumes for sale. That's all, folks. So if anybody has any questions or comments, let me know.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was super interesting. I think everybody probably got their fix for Law and Order tonight. In fact, I was thinking, could that be a Law and Order episode? Could that be an episode of one of those podcasts about crime or serial killers or whatever? So yeah, and it's interesting too, we didn't really pick this date because of the proximity to Halloween, but I think it was a fitting Halloween lecture, kind of some spooky topics, as well as just general awful the awful dark side of our history.
Well, it is interesting because we get like I say, so many people have ancestor worship, and they set people up on pedestals, and you can see from these records that, boy, we were pretty awful even back then.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of gives you this sense of maybe a little bit of a Wild West, at least in the early days. Even that duel that you were just talking about, we don't hear of duels. Maybe some of the crimes, the things that people do haven't quite changed. Maybe people are still doing awful things, but the punishments very much seem dated compared to how we deal with crime today. We'll get into a little bit more chatting. There's a few questions for you, but while we wait for everybody else to put some questions into the chat box, let me remind you of a few things. So go ahead and put your questions in the chat box, and we'll chat with Brian for a few minutes. But until then, just a reminder, again, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us tonight. If you've enjoyed the lecture series so far this fall or throughout all of our now 28 lectures, it would be great if you would consider making a donation to the museum, so of course that we can continue to provide the high quality programming that you expect from us. To make a donation, you can call the museum during our operating hours at 905-984-8880. And again, as I mentioned earlier, new this fall, you can also make a donation online via our ActiveNet portal. The portal was included, the link to the portal was included in your email reminder this evening. Your donation makes a difference. Thank you. Again, as I mentioned a few times already with our wonderful guests, including Brian, we now have 28 lectures, if you believe it or not, on the YouTube channel. So definitely catch up if you're new to the series. And we are adding the audio of the lectures to the podcast. We're about to lecture number 9 there, almost. 9 or 5-ish. Tomorrow, the episode, The Archaeology of a 19th Century Shipyard, where Dr. Kimberly Monk talked about her work at Chickluna Shipyard, will be going out tomorrow morning. So you can watch the podcast channels for that. If anybody needs help subscribing to any of this, by the way, if you're new to YouTube or to podcasts or to whatever, just send us an email and we'll help you out. We'd also like to remind everyone, of course, to, and there's the podcast. And we'd also, of course, like to remind everyone to definitely follow along all of our material on social media. We have lots of different types of videos, podcasts, blogs. I'm writing a blog series about the First Welland Canal right now. So there's tons of content. And if you're not following us, you're missing it. So don't miss it. Follow along and check us out on all of our channels. So we will definitely see everyone next time on November 16th for Sarah's lecture about housing and development in St. Catharines. It's going to be really interesting, looking at trends and how housing trends have impacted shown up in St. Catharines. So with that, we will take some questions. So yeah, Brian, we were talking briefly about the idea of the Wild West and the punishments. One of my questions was when I was working on an exhibit a little while ago, and one of the things that I kept coming across in the newspapers, and you probably have too, it's not criminal, but it's law related, was that they had to publish divorces in the newspaper because, of course, you had to appeal to the government, to Parliament or the legislature for a divorce, and that stopped eventually. And I just was wondering if you could give us a sense of when some of these, horrible medieval feeling punishments like being drawn and quartered stopped. When was particularly, like, when was the last hanging, and when was when did people stop getting halfway hung and then cut open and that kind of stuff? If you can give us a sense of the timeline of when that ended.
Yeah, things like standing in the pillory. I think that was outlawed in about or stopped in about the mid 1840s. With things like being drawn and quartered, I mean, that was a really draconian, awful punishment for people. And during the 1810s, 1820s, I think they were still actually doing the drawing and quartering. And then they said eventually it reached the point where they would just nick their shoulders and nick their tummy,
right,
as kind of a ritual drawing and quartering. Maybe they would just pull out a tiny bit of their intestine and hold a match under it, kind of thing.
Right.
But that they didn't actually lop them into pieces and distribute the body parts, to the four quarters. So that it's sort of, I think people became a little more humane around the mid 19th century, and they stopped doing these awful punishments.
Right.
And we certainly had, I think, hangings. I think the last hanging at the Niagara Street Jail was in about the 1950s?
That sounds right.
Late 40s, early 50s.
Date, but yeah, that sounds right. Maybe the 30s, but yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, so that's good. That gives us a bit of timeline. Actually, a question just came up in relation to this conversation. What is a pillory?
A pillory. It's a wooden stake that's driven into the ground that has a cross beam on it, and it's got notches cut in it. So you'd put your head in, put your hands in. Another piece was slammed down on top, and then it would be locked. So you'd be standing there, so angry townsmen could come and pelt you with excrement and garbage and spit on you.
In the movies, they call it the stocks or something like that. Yeah, very good. Pillory is a fancy word for stocks. Yeah, you can throw tomatoes and stuff. That's the fun part. I want to be in the crowd throwing tomatoes. That's the fun part of all those medieval movies. But I guess I should stop saying medieval because it existed in Niagara in the 1800s.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite humiliating as well to be in this thing at the mercy of your peers. And like I say, in the case of poor William Havens, to be standing in the pillory, and it was usually for about a 2 or 3 hour session. So to be in that pillory in the middle of winter, being pelted with garbage and everything, boy, that wouldn't have been nice at all.
Not at all. No. One question I had, and there's a question in the chat as well, from G. Spencer. Are there any stats on murder rates in the earlier years versus today? And my sort of accompanying question is, do you have a sense of how frequent some of these crimes were? We're not talking every day, but over a period of 100 years, there seems to be quite a lot. And do you have a sense of what kind of volume that we're working with?
Yeah, I don't have exact numbers for things like, murders or arson. I mean, the crimes like that, you'd see them, but not frequently.
Yeah.
Like, maybe, the same as today. I mean, you'll see a certain number of murders every year, but I mean, it wasn't a huge volume. Most of the crimes were always of the petty sort, you know, drunken, disorderly, um, uh,
Theft.
blaspheming, using
Yeah.
bad language, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Uh, and the murders, if you did have them, they were, like I say, few and far between, maybe one or two a year.
Right. Right. Yeah.
For the district.
Yeah, that gives us a better sense of, over a period of time. Yeah. But the handy chart that you pointed to in the constitutional is great when it's published, but it's not always reflective of the crimes that were happening in the county. For example, when I was researching the big shipyard strike in 1861, three of the guys burned down the Abbey Brothers shipyard at Port Robinson, and they appeared on the court records, but their punishment was never published, or I haven't found it yet, which is another historian problem. And so, like, that's a trick to understanding some of the stats that are available. It's not like the government has all these records of all these different courts from 200 years ago, or am I wrong?
No, they don't.
Yeah.
That's what I said. The Attorney General's office and the different levels of court that would be responsible for keeping these records for safekeeping. There's just such a sheer volume of them that they found that they couldn't keep everything.
Yeah.
So they're keeping random samplings of things, and there's been a lot of stuff that's been destroyed.
Yeah.
Or microfilmed and destroyed, but there's a lot that's disappeared that I'd love to know.
Yeah.
What else was out there?
Welcome everyone to being a historian, an archivist, and working in a museum. Many gaps, so that's great. There's a couple other comments here, Brian, and then we'll just wrap it up. But Deb Weiland says, I too grew up here in St. Catharines and often was on the bus to downtown past the old jail. Thank you for the picture. It was a historic, in brackets, creepy looking place. It's interesting that you say that, Deb. We have some records of wedding photos taken at the jail, because the building sometimes was thought to be beautiful. It was this Romanesque looking structure, and if you angled your photos the right way, it was kind of nice. They had a kind of a nice lawn out front as well, so people had their wedding pictures there. I guess if you set up your background the right way, then you're okay. Belle has a question as well, Brian. Belle says, I'm wondering about the approximate currency value. Do you have any idea how much £1 would be in today's money? So what kind of impact would a £1 fine or a £10 fine be on people?
There are currency converters that you can use, that you can actually plug in, like historical currency converters, that you can put in £1, and it'll calculate how much £1 in 1830 was equal to in dollars in 2021. When you consider that the average worker at the time probably was making between £1 and £2 a week.
Yeah. So
if they're being fined 10 shillings, that's a fairly big chunk out of your weekly paycheck that you're being fined. It probably,
if you're employed, like if the fine for being drunk and disorderly, some of those people appeared a number of times, so maybe their employment status was a little bit more transient. If you don't have an income and then you've got all these fines, then you can't pay the fines, then that's when you're going to end up in jail, right?
Yeah, and I would imagine that being fined something like £10 or something, that would probably be like the equivalent of maybe like $500 today.
That's wild.
I mean, it's quite a. I mean, it was a fair amount.
Yeah, definitely enough to discourage. Maybe not. I guess people still did stuff. So.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very, very much, Brian, for that excellent presentation. Again, I think everybody got their Law and Order fix for a little while, especially, and maybe someday we'll make a Law and Order Niagara 1800 or something like that. I won't wait by the phone for that telephone call from the producers of Law and Order. But anyway, thank you very, very much, everybody on the lecture tonight for attending, and thank you again, Brian, for joining us for the virtual museum lecture series. The virtual museum lecture series, everyone, is produced by the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center and the City of St. Catharines. Thanks very much, everybody. We'll see you on November 16th.
Ciao.
Just gotta wait for the lag now before I click off. All right.